This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, Alex C., C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., and Samantha G. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and for this first episode that we are going to have for March 2025, I'm going to talk about an interesting Greek goddess that, it's a name and a word that we're all familiar with in some context or another, but as a deity, she's not particularly talked about. And what I'm talking about today is the goddess known as Nemesis. Now, Nemesis is interesting because her name means a variety of different things. And we're going to talk about all of the different definitions of her name and the different backstories about her birth and the children that she is said to have, which is just quite an interesting thing, and the role that she has in terms of fate and also of fortune. Finally, the thing I'm going to want to talk about, and part of the reason that Nemesis is my topic for today, is the discovery of a new planet that is out. And again, I should maybe qualify new discovery. There's certainly been mathematics and things to talk about the possibility, but new discoveries are making the probability of the existence of this planet much higher, being called Planet 9 by some people and being called Planet X or maybe Planet 10 by others, depending on whether you count Pluto as a planet, and many of the scientific community do not. They treat Neptune as the last big planet. But we also have this object that seems to be out in our solar system orbit, but quite far out. And I'm going to talk about this planet because at least one of the initial discussions of this planet this mysterious planet sort of on the edge that seems to drive the way in which these trans-Neptunian objects orbit, or the way that they kind of launch in our direction. The name proposed for it was Nemesis. Now, it's interesting because the word nemesis, when we think about it in popular culture and the way that we use it, we use the word nemesis to talk about somebody who's an enemy, right? Or somebody who is our foil. If you have some kind of a villain who has a nemesis, right? The nemesis, oftentimes in these kind of constructed good versus evil battles, the nemesis could be the one who takes down the villain, or conversely, the hero, it could be their archenemy who ends up being has the potential to destroy them or to bring them down. So, and Nemesis does actually have this kind of sense when we think about her and her attributes. So we're going to start by talking about who she is, talking about her parentage and so forth, what kind of a being she's expected to be, what her name is supposed to mean, and then we're going to get into the various places that she's mentioned, and this is mainly going to go through primary sources and things like that. So we're going to look at that in particular from theoi.com. And finally, we're going to, after we've talked about her and about the kind of understanding or inflection of this particular goddess in terms of her attributes, and also the way that she might compare to some other deities with similar attributes in other cultures. I'm thinking particularly among the Matrikas, of Indri or Indrani among the Matrikas. Then we're going to talk about this whole idea of Planet X and what it means. and kind of tie it all together. I feel like we've been pulling a lot of astronomical stuff into this podcast recently, but there does seem to be a whole lot that's going on in that sphere, and whether you're interested in astronomy or astrology, or just the whole current of change that's going on right now, it's interesting to consider these forces, whether you see this as some kind of an omen, or whether you see these things as being projections, really, of the psychological forces that are around us. You could look at it either way, really, strictly speaking. So let's get into our discussion of Nemesis. Now, just starting, really the best place to start for me is Theoi, because Theoi is the most accurate. It's the one that has the most information in terms of, like I said, primary sources, encyclopedic entries that are academically correct. So we're going to start here, and we're going to read the description of Nemesis from Theoi. It says, Nemesis was the goddess of indignation against and retribution for evil deeds and undeserved good fortune. That's important to remember. She was a personification of the resentment aroused in men by those who committed crimes with apparent impunity or who had inordinate good fortune. That's an interesting idea. And I think in our culture right now of being worried about, well, our billionaire class culture, for example, where we talk about the 1%ers versus everybody else, Nemesis is probably going to be an interesting topic, depending on your viewpoint on that. It says, Nemesis directed human affairs in such a way as to maintain equilibrium. Her name means she who distributes or deals out. Now we are going to talk about other etymologies of her name and what they might mean. Happiness and unhappiness were measured out by her, care being taken that happiness was not too frequent or not too excessive. This is interesting. If this happened, Nemesis could bring about losses and suffering. As one who checked extravagant favors by Tyche, or fortune, Nemesis was regarded as an avenging or punishing deity. Now, there's an interesting idea. Now, do you ever have that where you go into a long run of good fortune? You know, it's the day you get up, everything goes right, everything's on time, you walk outside, you find like a $20 bill on the sidewalk, you go for that job interview and get the job, you go somewhere, and I don't know, all these like string of nice things. There's no traffic when you drive, like you just have these really, really great day. And then you might have a string of luck where all of a sudden, money comes in out of nowhere that you didn't expect, and this and that. And so what do we often say when that happens? I think the expression is, at least in the United States, the expression is, it's a cliche of waiting for the other shoe to drop. So there's almost this sense of, this is too good. Something bad has to happen to interrupt this streak, right? We're not believers that fortune, that's good fortune, that brings us that kind of temporal happiness is going to last forever. We are assuming that dreadful cloud is going to be over us, and that at some point, it's going to, there's going to be some kind of reversal of this good fortune. Now, if we think about this in Taoist terms, in Taoism, you have this idea that the wheel of the Tao turns, and that at some points we are on a high point on the wheel, and other times we are at a low point. So, what is empty is going to be filled, what is filled is going to be empty, right? So there's this equilibrium, and perhaps looking at it in the Eastern way is a little less, I don't know, I think it's a little bit less feeling like this is somehow the way in which we tend to look at things as a negative in this culture. You could have all kinds of great things going on for you, but you focus on the one thing that's effed up. And honestly, I feel like Nemesis is maybe kind of a manifestation of that. And indeed, Nemesis is considered to be a daimon or a daimonic being. And daimons, in addition to being intermediaries between gods and mortals, because they were often sent at the behest of gods, which is why they're considered intermediaries, they're considered to be these kinds of psychological or social forces, the personification of them. So when we talk about a daimon, this is what we are talking about. And it's the way, and you can also think of Nemesis potentially as a self-sabotaging energy in this sense, because when we are on a good streak and we are doing well and we are confident, that moment where we doubt ourselves and trip up because we feel that somehow this is too good to be true, right? Nemesis can certainly be a representation of that. So let's keep going. In myth, Nemesis was particularly concerned with matters of love. She appears as an avenging agent in the stories of Narcissus and Nicaea, actually, I'm saying that wrong, whose callous actions brought about the death of their wooers. In some versions of the Trojan War, she was the mother of Helen and is shown in scenes of seduction by Paris, pointing an accusing finger at the girl. So, yeah, we will talk about her connection to Helen in a moment. Nemesis was sometimes depicted as a winged goddess. Her attributes were the apple branch, rain, the lash, the sword, or the balance, meaning the scales, just like justice. Her name was derived from the Greek words nemesis and nemo, or nemen, meaning dispenser of dues. The Romans usually used the Greek name of the goddess, but sometimes also named her invidia, meaning jealousy, and rivalitas, or jealous rivalry. Yeah, because rivalitas, you see the word rival built in there. So that also, as you might imagine, connects Nemesis to the idea of jealousy or envy. And this is because it's the idea that if your fortune is too good, there's going to be somebody who's going to be seeking to take you down or bring it away from you. Because human beings seem to be rather competitive by nature. We can't support and let other people enjoy their good fortune. We have to take them down. Now, again, the idea of fortune is quite interesting here because we live in a society that suggests that, if we work hard or are ambitious or are clever or whatever, and we amass a fortune, that somehow we're entitled to that. We worked for it. And other people who might need support or might need assistance, those people are sort of quote-unquote mooching off the system. And we see this kind of idea in here, where the idea is those that have good fortune have somehow earned it, or that they have to have earned it, and if they haven't, then there needs to be some kind of retribution. I think this also can occur in situations where we have people who have very good fortune, but then don't want to share it with others, who become greedy and say, no, this is for me and for me personally. Like I won the game and it's mine. And people tend to resent that as well. And again, you can get into the ethics of, what cases does the person probably deserve to be brought down, and in what other cases does it seem maybe like it's not quite fair. But in any case, it's worth thinking about that as we go through this podcast, in thinking about the way in which people deal with their attitudes towards wealth, the acquisition of wealth, and the connection of wealth to what's been earned, as opposed to what has been gained, maybe in a way that people don't consider to be ethical, or to be like, it's like somebody has fallen into a spade of good luck, and it seems like it's not fair to somebody else. Like somehow everybody needs to earn the good fortune that they have, right? So we have this idea, and the Indo-European root for Nemesis is nem, which means to distribute. That also brings to mind economic systems in particular, because if we think about the distribution of wealth, if we talk about a government that gets involved in distribution of wealth, we call it a socialist government, right? The idea that everybody gets a fair share. Although, of course, the problem with a lot of these systems in practice is that people get greedy, and if they have the opportunity to take more for themselves, they do. Similarly, though, it can happen in an open free capitalist market, too, where you can have people who, through whatever connections or favors, not necessarily hard work, can also gain all of this as well. So we do see this Nemesis idea is definitely one that we relate to in this culture. Now, Nemesis, though, as we've noted, is also connected to love and to relationships, or really to any kind of actions that people do when they enjoy good fortune and they either waste it or they do something that is unfair or something that's going to upset the balance. Now, one thing I keep thinking about with Nemesis is the idea of how she's very similar to the Erinyes or the Furies in their function. And she is there really to correct injustice. Now, there's a writing, and I'm going to probably find it here in Theoi, but there's a quote that says, when Nemesis and Eidos, which is shame, I think this is probably in Hesiod's description of the ages of man, it says, when Nemesis and Eidos leave Earth for the deathless gods, humanity will have no hope. And this is because they are the means of corrective action for injustice. What this means is that if you have no shame for your acts, and if you have no sense of what's balanced and what's fair, and if they are not part of our, if we act completely without shame or without a sense of that fairness or balance, or maybe even you could argue that people who do get jealous and resentful and try to check things, if that was actually to leave humankind, that greed would run rampant and there would be no corrective action. And that's an interesting way to think about things, because that suggests to us that if we enjoy good fortune and other people envy us for it, that somehow that need to socially remain in an acceptable space is something that that drives charity, or that says, oh, well, I've gained this wealth, but I'm willing to share it. I was talking recently, I think my friend actually found it when I was doing a live stream, and I want to say, was it Luke 12? I can't remember, but there's a saying of Jesus that basically to he who has been given much, much is expected. So the idea is that with good fortune comes the responsibility to think of the community and not only of oneself. So we've got this definition of Nemesis. Now, where does she come from? Well, according to Hesiod, she's the daughter of Nyx, who's the night goddess, and Nyx produced her alone. She has no father. So she comes out of the darkness of night along with Eris and several other ones, Eris being the goddess of strife or chaos. And we will talk about Eris in another podcast. But we have this idea of her as being this creature that comes out of the night. And Hesiod does not really have a very positive view of this particular offspring. Hesiod's theogony, here we go, verse 21, or paragraph 21. And Nyx bare hateful Moros, which is doom, and black care, which is violent death, and Thanatos, which is death, and she bare Hypnos, which is sleep, and the tribe of the Oneroi, which are dreams. And again, the goddess murky Nyx, though she lay with none, bare Momos, which is blame, and painful Oisis, who's misery, and the Hesperides, who are basically the guardians of the western lands. And also she bare the Morai, who are the Fates. Okay, so fate comes out of night. And the ruthless avenging Keris, which are the death fates. Also, deadly Nyx bore Nemesis, who they describe here as envy, to afflict mortal men, and after her, Apate, which is deceit, or ate in some cases, and Philotes, which is friendship, which is also interesting, and hateful Geros, which is old age, and hard-hearted Eris, which is strife. Okay, so these are all the siblings of Nemesis, according to Hesiod. If we look at some of the stories of her, there are some other stories that will suggest that she is a daughter of Oceanus, or Okeanos, which was Pausanias' description. He says Okeanos is the father of Nemesis of Rhamnos. And Pausanias has also said the Athenians say that the father of the goddess and Rhamnos is Okeanos, or Oceanus. Some will say that it's not just Nyx by herself, but that it's Nyx and the primordial ocean who have borne Nemesis. And others say that she might be a daughter of Zeus. And this fits into the story of her children. Now, Nemesis is said to be in a text called the Cypria, which is part of what they call the epic cycle. The epic cycle is a collection of texts about the Trojan War, and it tends to cover the period of time after the war, and also the late stages of the war. In some cases, the early stages as well. That's where we get the story, for example, of Iphigenia at Aulis. But that's a pre-war story. And the epic cycle tends to cover everything where the Iliad ends. Because the Iliad doesn't end with the end of the war. The Iliad ends with the death of Hector, who is the Trojan prince, and Achilles' desecration of his body. And then finally, King Priam of Troy making supplication to Achilles to give his son's body back. And it is kind of a sad and touching scene at the end. Sorry for spoilers if you haven't read the Iliad yet, but some of you may not be planning to do that. But there's this kind of touching scene at the end where their bodies are exchanged and the dead are buried and so forth. But that's the end of it. That's not the end of the war. We see in these other accounts of the Trojan War that we might see alternate motivations or alternate starting points. And again, we might see these different endings as to how different heroes ended up, or who died, or who killed who, and so on and so forth. But the one story in there that's interesting from the Cyprii that relates to Nemesis is the idea that she is the mother of Helen. Now, who is Helen? Okay, probably most people have heard of, quote-unquote, Helen of Troy. I say quote-unquote because Helen of Troy is really, if you're going to be giving her a name in terms of her husband, she's really Helen of Sparta, because her husband was King Menelaus of Sparta. And her mother was said to be Leda, and her father was said to be Zeus. So, okay, in that particular story, Leda comes and she is seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan. He comes in, and of course Zeus, he's never, they always say he comes and, there's this attitude that he's coming and ravishing this young woman, but of course we know that he's probably doing something that nowadays, it's that R word we're not allowed to say anymore on YouTube or anywhere else. But yeah, there's definitely this idea of Zeus rather forcibly mating with Leda. But another version, this is when Zeus mated with Nemesis, and in this version of the story, Nemesis is the daughter of Zeus. So I'm going to read this from Stasinus of Cyprus, and this is from the Cypria fragment. And yeah, we don't know, they're saying Stasinus of Cyprus or Hegesias of Aegina. It could be either one. It says, rich-haired Nemesis gave birth to her, meaning Helen, when she had been joined in love with Zeus, the king of the gods, by harsh violence. Oh, there you go. For Nemesis tried to escape him and liked not to lie in love with her father Zeus, the son of Kronos. For shame and indignation vexed her heart. I think there could be a lot of reasons why you would not want to do that, but therefore she fled him over the land and fruitless dark sea. But Zeus ever pursued and longed in his heart to catch her. Now she took the form of a fish and sped over the waves of the loud roaring sea, and now over Oceanus' stream, and the furthest bounds of the earth. Now she sped over the furrowed land, always turning into such dread creatures as the dry land nurtures, that she might escape him. But of course she does not escape him, and she ends up producing an egg as well, and this egg is presented to Leda and Tyndareus, and they raise Helen as their own child. But in fact, in this case, she would be a goddess, not just a demigoddess, with a immortal woman and a god. But in this version, she'd basically be fully divine. Her mother would be a Daimon, and her father would be the king of the gods, would be Zeus. Now, here's the thing: as we understand this, when Zeus mates with various siblings, children, nieces, nephews, whatever, not just him. I mean, this happens with the other gods as well. And we, from a social perspective, think this is just absolutely horrible. And yeah, I mean, if you were talking about this as a couple of mortals in this kind of thing, it would be an unacceptable kind of situation. We now tend to believe that when we look at God, we always talk about the idea of emulating the god. Certainly that is a Hindu concept, right? The Ishtadevata, the qualities of the god. And we also will talk about things, for example, in Christianity, there will be the idea of emulating Christ, right? Try to emulate Christ in his perfection or whatever. So we do have this idea that the deity is one that one should emulate, or at least the idea that the one who is the authority figure should be following some kind of strict moral or ethical code. What we tend to forget when it comes to deities is that they're forces, and these are forces that are coming together for a certain purpose. Yeah, so basically Nemesis is this rather contrary force that is being embraced by the king of the gods. And the daughter that she produces is said to be the most beautiful woman on earth. Now, this being the case, Helen ends up creating a kind of situation with her birth that later becomes, in the Cypria, the pretext for the Trojan War. So when you read the account in the Cypria, it will talk about Zeus and Thetis. Now, Thetis is she's the mother of Achilles. Okay, she is a sea nymph, so she is divine. Now, Thetis was supposed to have borne Achilles in her marriage to Peleus, who's considered to be the father of who is Achilles' father. Zeus did love Thetis and wanted to, of course, ravish her as well, but he had received a prophecy that any child again, it was one of those cases of the child will be better than his father. You know what I mean? That the idea that the son will be able to best the father. And Zeus never wanted this kind of situation, so he marries Thetis to Peleus instead. And Achilles does indeed become greater than his father in terms of his heroic deeds. But what's interesting here is that the two of them are plotting to bring an end to humankind. Now, I was having a conversation with somebody about this the other day, because I started thinking about this a little bit more deeply. And when we talk about Nemesis, Or when we talk about, let's just get back to the Trojan War. When we talk about the idea of ending humankind, there's a bunch of different inferences that come into play here. So first of all, okay, if we think about the idea of a great flood. Now, the great flood, frequently people think of Noah in the flood, Noah's Ark. That's a common reference point that people have when thinking about the great flood. Now, of course, that was not the only great flood mentioned in epic literature or in ancient documents. So certainly there's one that's mentioned. I mean, the Sumerians have a version of this story. The Babylonians have a version of this story. Even the Greeks have a version of this story. And so the Great Flood is one of those things that is, there's a lot of different versions of the Great Flood story. And depending on which area you're coming from, the reason that this flood happens is either because there's too many humans and they're overpopulating the earth. So rather than going out and having a hunt, I guess, they just bring in a big flood and drown everybody out, right? Now, the other reason for the flood is that people are corrupt. And that because humankind is corrupt, they don't honor the gods, they don't do the right things, then we're going to wipe the slate clean and start again with potentially a new batch. Now, in the Bible, this is said to be Noah and his family because they are very pious. They are told in advance that this is going to happen, and so they build this ark. And so when everybody else is swept away, they're able to survive. Now, there are other survivors, and that is the real key feature of that story. You either have them floating in a chest or floating in a boat or something where they are protected from the rising floodwaters. And regardless of the version of the myth, whether it's Ziusudra who's been saved, whether it's Utnapishtim who's been saved, whether it's Deucalion and Pyrrha who have been saved, it's all the same kind of a thing. They're bent on destroying mankind, and there is a survivor or a pair of survivors in a chest or on a boat of some kind that's able to later repopulate the earth. And again, the motives vary. Whether or not they wanted anybody to survive, that's also something that's varied. But what's interesting about the Noah story in particular, if you read it in Genesis, and it's around Genesis 5, I think, when you read the Noah story, it says that the Nephilim were upon the earth at that time. And then it said there's a line that says something like, some say that these are the heroes of old. So, okay, the popular conception of the Nephilim is that these are the children who are the product of angels and humans mating. Okay. I have some personal issues with that idea and story, but I won't get into those here. But nonetheless, the idea is that Nephilim are this race of giants or these race of beings that have this kind of divine attribute. And what's interesting is that in biblical stories of the Nephilim, the idea is that they come in and they destroy everything. Like they're so big that they're destructive and they're consuming everything and they're creating famine and drought and everything else so that they have to be destroyed. And really, it seems like destroying these quote-unquote Nephilim seems to be more the motivation rather than, people are sinful. And what's interesting is the comparing them to the heroes of old. This brings us back to the Trojan War, because many of the heroes of the Trojan War were, in fact, demigods. They were the heroes of old, quote-unquote, that were being talked about, or at least the children of some other heroes of old. The Iliad is filled with an all-star cast. Maybe the only one that has a bigger all-star cast is the Argonautica. I mean, you have these very heroic men who have divine parentage of some type. So when Zeus and Thetis plot to destroy humanity, the question then becomes, is this a similar motivation here? That we are trying to get rid of this sort of equivalent of the Nephilim, all of these heroes. Now, of course, a lot of these heroes don't die. It's almost like once they go through battle, the ones who do survive end up being treated as gods. They're carried off to Elysian fields, usually bodily transported at the moment of when they're supposed to die, and they have a cult worship. You'll have, temples or shrines to Achilles, for instance, or to Menelaus, or to Idomeneus, or Diomedes, or any of the great heroes of the Trojan War. Certainly, we've talked about the story of Aeneas. Now, he fought on the other side, but because of his divine parentage, he also has this kind of designation. So it seemed like in the Cypria that Zeus and Thetis were plotting to wipe out humankind again, and there is a discussion of that being because of corruption. Now, is the corruption this race of people who are potentially going to be better than the gods? That's not explicitly stated, but it does make me wonder, because it does seem that the Bible version with the flood does mention the Nephilim. Now, as I mentioned also, the Greeks do have their own version of the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha is actually the story that they have of the flood, and it has a rather different ending in the sense of how the world is repopulated. But nonetheless, there's this idea that mankind, or humankind, I should say, has to be wiped out, or that there are these beings that are either need to be gotten rid of because they're too good to be among humans. They're these beings that are either a threat to mortals, or they're what they excel at could potentially make them better than the gods. So, but of course, we don't see a lot of them necessarily get wiped out in the Trojan War, so you might even assume this is kind of a test, right? How many of them are going to survive and become divinities? We talk about that with Hercules or Heracles doing his 12 labors and then becoming immortal. You kind of wonder if this isn't a similar kind of thing. Well, in this version of the story, Nemesis is the mother of Helen. And so what happens is there's the wedding feast of Thetis and Peleus, and the goddess Eris, another one of the children of Nyx, shows up when she's not invited because she is the goddess of discord, and she chucks this golden apple in that says, "To the fairest." You have the judgment of Paris. Paris judges Aphrodite to be the most beautiful because the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all want to claim this apple, and they're like, well, let's get Paris, Prince of Troy, to judge. Yeah, that's great. And Paris ends up saying that Aphrodite is the most beautiful, but mainly because she's bribed him with Helen as his wife. So he goes, and the first thing he does is violate Xenia, the rules of hospitality. Menelaus welcomes him to his house, goes off in a ship, and then Paris just picks up Helen and takes her away with him. Now, if you read Herodotus will say, oh, well, this was done in retribution because of the way in which Jason stole Medea, during the Argonautica. And I don't know, these are totally different kingdoms, and I don't know, but that seemed to be the Trojan justification. Oh, well, you had somebody from the Greeks or from the Achaean League who took away somebody else's bride, so we're going to take, one of theirs. It seemed to be that was Herodotus's kind of justification. Of course, then he writes after it, but that's just what the Persians say. So anyway, there's all of these different kind of nuances here. Nonetheless, Helen is taken away, and Helen becomes the reason for the war. Those in the Achaean League, many of them wanted her as their wife, but she chose Menelaus. And so when she chose Menelaus, they all agreed that, they were going to uphold his claim to her, and that if anybody else tried to take her away, that they would go to battle on his behalf. So when Paris takes her away, this league goes over and they're going to fight with Troy, and it's a long war. It's a 10-year war. You don't really get that sense of that from the Iliad, because the Iliad only covers a few months. Maybe not even a few months. It's a very short period of time that it covers. And again, you have to fill in with the fragments of these other epics. The Iliad's the most complete one that tell us about what happened there. And what happens, who wins and how we know who wins and who dies. Achilles dies and who else dies. We find out later what all the casualties are. But the idea that this was another effort to wipe out humankind, and this is where Nemesis gets involved as a kind of daimonic force, because the idea is that she now becomes an agent of kind of divine retribution through her child, who is Helen. So Helen now is viewed as really a mark of bad fortune. And this is not necessarily the first time we've seen something like this. Like, I always think of Harmonia, who is the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, or Mars and Venus, if you like. Harmonia is given this gift by Hephaestus, because, of course, obviously Mars is, Ares, let's stick to the Greek. Ares has been sleeping with Aphrodite, who is actually the wife of Hephaestus. Hephaestus is not pleased about this, but he's told that he has to make peace, so he gives this necklace as a wedding gift that he's made, but the necklace is cursed. Okay, so I almost think of it as being the same thing. Helen's the most beautiful woman in the world that everyone wants to possess, but it seems to be a kind of bad luck to possess her. because, because now she is kind of this. I mean, of course, she's a woman, right? We don't think of her almost as having her own identity here. Although that does come into question. The question becomes, does she go with Paris willingly, or does she, was she carried off against her will? You're not really sure. And certainly there are writings like Euripides' play The Trojan Women, where when Menelaus sees Helen at the end of the war, he's almost ready to kill her. But he doesn't. And certainly when we get to the Odyssey, the two of them are back in their kingdom happily, or at least they seem happily, because it seems like they kind of get a little cheap shot at each other once in a while. But Helen is, she is the wife of Menelaus, and the war created so many casualties, so much destruction. So there's the idea of Nemesis as being connected to destruction. So interesting. So that's the main story where we hear her mentioned, other than Zeus's pursuit of her and her giving birth to Helen. There is another. She is said to actually have another set of children, potentially, in another variation of the story. And the Telekines, they're called. They're a group of people. They were supposed to be the original inhabitants of the island of Rhodes, and they were known in Crete and in Cyprus. And again, their parents were either considered to be Pontus and Gaia, Pontus being kind of another version of the primordial sea, Gaia being the Earth Mother, or in some versions, Tartarus and Nemesis. Okay, this was in the Bacchylides, fragment 52 of Bacchylides. Okay, the four famous Telkines, Actios, Megalesos, Ormenos, and Lycos. He calls the children of Nemesis and Tartarus. Now, Tartarus is the great abyss beneath the earth. So that's rather interesting. Now, what they are famous for, it says, they were the Telekines were ministers of the gods. It says they were regarded as cultivators of the soil and ministers of the gods, and as such they came from Crete to Cyprus and from thence to Rhodes, or they proceeded from Rhodes to Crete and Boeotia. So yeah, they're talking here, I'm just reading from Wikipedia about the different towns associated with them and the different cities that the various children went to. But it says they were also regarded as wizards and envious daimons. Their very eyes and aspect were said to be destructive. They had it in their power to bring on hail, rain, and snow, and to assume any form they pleased. They further produced a substance poisonous to living things. Thus they were called Alastores for supervising in the ceaseless wanderings of people, and Palmneoi for pouring the water of sticks with their palms and in their hands in order to make fields infertile. The Telekines were described to have stings and being rough as the encoid, and thus the name Teleokinos, that having a poisonous telos like an echinoid. But also it says that they are artists, that they were said to have invented useful arts and institutions, and to have made images of the gods. They were metallurgists, okay, that's another aspect of being a magician, really. And skilled metalworkers in brass and iron made a trident for Poseidon and a sickle for Kronos, both ceremonial weapons. With their help and the Cyclops, the smith god Hephaestus forged the cursed necklace of Harmonia. Okay, so we're back to that again. Because of their excellent workmanship, the Telekines were maligned by rival workmen and thus received their bad reputation. Now that's interesting. So here they are. They're supposed to be the children of Nemesis and Tartarus. Now in Tartarus, if there is a place of punishment in ancient Greece, and this is a place where people rarely go, it is certainly the Titans who lost the battle with what we now think of as the Olympian gods are confined to the depths of Tartarus. So they tend to represent those very potentially destructive forces that are deep within the earth. And so, yeah, but their connection to the Cyclops, which are at least one category of those beings, although we do know of some Cyclops who live on various islands in that particular region as well, there's this idea that they are so good at their craft. So here we have this idea of fortune again, someone who is so good that they are envied or maligned by others. Now, in this case, that's not clear whether they're being maligned by gossip or whether they really just have this malignant streak in them. And the implication would be, if they are children of Tartarus and of Nemesis, that there is this almost idea that they are beings of retribution. Like they use their art and their work to bring about bad fortune for people perhaps who have either had excessive good fortune or perhaps, there's some kind of an injustice. Like you could argue with Hephaestus that the fact that he was, his wife made a fool out of him and he was told to kind of suck it up, that he might have had, every right to be jealous and to get revenge, right? Just given his position. So this is interesting, just to go on about them. The Telechines were entrusted by Rhea with the upbringing of Poseidon, which they accomplished with the aid of Capopheria, one of Oceanus' daughters. Another version says that Rhea accompanied them to Crete from Rhodes, where 9 of the Telechines, known as the Curetes, were selected to bring up Zeus. But it says in other versions of the tale, Rhea, Apollo, and Zeus were hostile to the Telechines. The gods eventually killed them because they began to use magic for malignant purposes. Particularly, they produced a mixture of Stygian water and sulfur, which killed animals and plants. Accounts vary on how they were either destroyed by flood, Zeus's thunderbolt, Poseidon's trident, which would have been ironic if they made it, or else Apollo assumed the shape of a wolf to kill them. They apparently lost in the Titanomachy, the battle between the gods and the Titans. That's interesting. They seem to almost be titanic forces in this way. So that almost implies that, in this particular version at least, that Nemesis would have to be the child of Nyx. Because otherwise, she can't be the daughter of Zeus and then producing the Telechines who are involved in the upbringing of Zeus. You know what I mean? It can't, logically, that doesn't work. Although there are other non-logical things in Greek myth for sure. Okay, so we have these, so they're connected to these beings that are of smithcraft and metallurgy, and they're using the waters of the underworld, of Hades, to make these things that are poisonous to life, which is rather interesting. So these are sometimes said to be the children of Nemesis. Depends on which version that you follow. Yeah, so I'm looking through some of the fragments about Nemesis and how she is described in different places. We mainly see her mentioned in Roman writings like Pindar and Aeschylus, and Plato mentions her as well. Of course, that makes sense because Plato, if he's writing about morals and ethics, from his Plato's laws, he says, throughout all his life, he must diligently observe reverence of speech towards his parents in all things, seeing that for light and winged words there is a most heavy penalty. For over all such matters, Nemesis, messenger of decay, which is justice, is appointed to keep watch. Wherefore the son must yield to his parents when they are wroth. So in other words, there's this idea that one can't be flippant to their parents because Nemesis will be watching over, and she is appointed as this daemon of decay, the goddess of justice. I've talked about the Greek gods as not having any morals or ethics, but certainly the idea of both decay and xenia, the idea of keeping what's balanced and just, and also of providing hospitality to strangers and observing the rules of hospitality. These seem to be the structures, the kind of social structures or ethical structures that the Greek gods seem to have that was translated into Greek society. Yeah, so there's a whole lot in here. There's an Orphic hymn to Nemesis as well. And it says, "Thee, Nemesis, I call, almighty queen, by whom the deeds of mortal life are seen, eternal much revered of boundless sight, alone rejoicing in the just and right, changing the counsels of the human breast, forever various, rolling without rest. To every mortal is thy influence known, and men beneath thy righteous bondage groan. For every thought within the mind concealed is to thy sight precipitously revealed. The soul unwilling to reason to obey, by lawless passion ruled, thine eyes survey. All to see, hear, and rule, O power divine, whose nature equity contains, is thine. Come, blessed holy goddess, hear my prayer, and make the mystic's life thy constant care. Give aid benignant, I didn't know that was a word, in the needful hour, and strength abundant to the reasoning power. And far avert the dire, unfriendly race of counsels, impious, arrogant, and base." Okay, so we have these different things. We don't actually have more stories of her or her actions, but we know that she is there keeping a watchful eye to see that people are obeying, staying within boundaries, which is why I say she seems to have this connection to the Erinyes, even though she's not technically one of them. She does have this connection to Tartarus, which the Erinyes have later on. So there is this kind of underworld tie there. And Nemesis seems to be kind of she seems to be this figure. The fact that we're seeing her mainly mentioned in later writings, with the exception of Hesiod, I almost feel like she becomes this daemon who becomes associated with the idea of punishment after death, or the idea of divine retribution, or what we might now call, the idea of karma that one has earned, right? The idea that your actions are going to have consequences. And so Nemesis is the one who's going to bring those consequences if something is out of balance. You either receive too much good fortune, or you are somebody who is very careless about, preserving order and civility, which is rather interesting. Now, here I'm just reading from Wikipedia. Nemesis is also called Rhamnusia, and she said she was the goddess who personified retribution for the sin of hubris, arrogance before the gods. Yeah, now that's interesting because we don't always necessarily see Nemesis appear when somebody commits an act of hubris, and there are many of them. I mean, Ovid talks about many of them. A lot of the metamorphoses he mentions in that book are mentioned with people who have, Arachne being a good example, saying that she was a greater weaver than Athena / Minerva, and that that basically just boasted that Athena was not as good as her. So Athena appears in the guise of an old woman, tells her, "You should not say that." And she says, yeah, whatever, let her challenge me. I challenge her right now. And so the woman, of course, turns into Athena, or again, I keep thinking this is a Roman tale, so Minerva. And she says, okay. And interestingly, at the end of that story, it seems like Ariadne actually did produce the better work. So Athena turned her into a spider. This is why we think of spiders as being arachnids. That's where the term comes from Arachne, from the fact that she's a spinner, right? And so in other words, we're seeing this immediate retribution. We're not seeing Minerva or Athena calling upon Nemesis or her Roman equivalent, Invidia, to come and do something to destroy this person. So she only seems to appear at certain times. Just see what else we have about her mythology. Yeah, she's basically as the balancer of fortune's chance, and she could be associated with Tyche. Divine retribution is a major theme in Greek worldview, providing the unifying theme of the tragedies of Sophocles and many other literary works. Hesiod states, "Deadly Nyx bore Nemesis, and that also deadly Nyx bore Nemesis, an affliction to mortals subject to death." And again, she appears more concrete form in the Cypria in the way that we had explained. And it says she is implacable justice, that of Zeus in the Olympian scheme of things, although it is clear she existed prior to him, as her images look similar to several other goddesses such as Cybele, Rhea, Demeter, and Artemis. And so, yes, she is an avenger of crime, the punisher of hubris, and as such is akin to Ate and the Erinyes. Now, Ate being deception. Now, if you've read the Iliad, again, Ate is a regular theme throughout the Iliad, where Ate appears and causes a kind of confusion or deception that leads to chaos. False dreams and false thoughts, or somebody Agamemnon tells Achilles in his apology that he was afflicted by Ate, or deception, and this is why he treated Achilles poorly. Hera uses Ate when she brings Zeus to Mount Ida, dresses up and looks very beautiful, and seduces him, makes him come to Mount Ida to make love to her so that she's bribed Hypnos into putting him to sleep, so her and Athena can sneak in and do stuff and make progress in the war. So, Ate is this idea of deception. Now, this is interesting. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Nemesis enacted divine retribution on Narcissus for his vanity. After he rejected the advances of the nymph Echo, Nemesis lured him to a pool where he caught sight of his own reflection and fell in love with it, eventually dying. His body was transformed by the nymphs into a narcissus flower. So, right, in this idea of a love tale, when he is very cruel to Echo, who is in love with him, and of course, Echo has done something to upset Hera, which is why or Juno in this particular version, so she is condemned every time he tries to say something to her. She can only repeat the last line of what he said, like an echo. And so he gets very angry and he's very cruel to her. And so Nemesis does not take kindly to the way he's treated her. And so she lures him to look at himself, and his self-absorption is what leads to his death. Now, here's another interesting one. In Nonnus's epic called the Dionysiaca, Aura, who is one of Artemis's virgin attendants, questions her mistress's virginity due to the feminine and curvaceous shape of her body. Aura claimed that no goddess or woman with that sort of figure would be a virgin, and asserted her own superiority over the goddess thanks to her own lean and boyish silhouette. Artemis, enraged, went to Nemesis and asked for revenge. Now, I find this interesting. I'm going to stop for a moment because I always tell people that Dionysus is the only deity who has always treated women with respect. Well, here's an exception. Nemesis promised to the goddess that Aurora would have her punishment, and that the punishment would be to lose the virginity she took pride in. Nemesis then contacted Eros, the god of love, and he struck Dionysus with one of his arrows. Dionysus fell madly in love with Aura, and when she rebuffed his advances, got her drunk. We won't get into the rest of what he did, but as she was unconscious, he took advantage of her, and then Nemesis' plan was brought to success. I mean, I don't know. If I was going to be defensive of Dionysus there, I would say that this was obviously a form, in this case, of divine retribution. One that, anybody who would stand there and go to Artemis, haha, I'm better than you, or any of the gods, really. It's like, why would you not think that something really, really horrific like that would happen to you? And again, if we were talking about, or ordinary stories, ordinary myths, you would, obviously, this is a horrendous act that occurs. But at the same time, it's almost like, well, yeah, this is the one time that we see that Dionysus does this, but it seems like he is doing it at the behest of Nemesis. Okay, and so, interestingly, she apparently had a local cult festival called the Nemesia. It was held at Athens. Its object was to avert the nemesis of the dead, who were supposed to have the power of punishing the living if their cult had been neglected. Now, this is what we see in Sophocles' Electra, and also in Rhodey's book on Psyche, which, boy, I haven't read that one in a long time. Yes. Okay. So she's had several different sanctuaries where she was honored. She was a tutelary deity of the drill ground as Nemesis Campestris in Rome. And although there was some who say she was a goddess that was connected to gladiators and those who ran the arenas, but they said there's really no proof of that. They said she seemed to have represented a kind of imperial fortuna who dispensed imperial retribution on the one hand and imperially subsidized gifts on the other. Both were functions of the popular gladiatorial ludi held in Roman arenas. Okay, she is sometimes known as a Nemesis Pax, shown on imperial coinage, mainly under Claudius and Hadrian. And in the 3rd century AD, there is evidence in the belief of an all-powerful Nemesis Fortuna. She was worshipped by a society called Hadrian's Freedmen. So, interesting. Generally, she's considered to be a goddess of ill fortune, but in some cases, she is someone who can bestow benevolence as well. And again, apparently according to one's merits, whether or not she is going to do that or be able to do that for you. Yeah, so we have this interesting figure. Now, I'm just going to open up this one thing. I guess what I would want to say with thinking about Nemesis nowadays, we definitely are living in a time where there feels like there's some severe imbalances. It doesn't really matter where you are in the world. We definitely see this idea of a very small percentage of people having all the money, or we have like a billionaire class. And then we have people, the rest of the people seem to be footing the bill for society. In a lot of countries, the U.S. especially, but not just the U.S., billionaires don't really pay their fair share. For example, I'm just mentioning this, they don't pay nearly the amount of taxes based on the capitalist kind of credo that they're almost treated like god kings, like, oh, well, they're job creators and things. At least that used to be the mantra that they would recite. But the reality is that they're not job creators. They are, or if they do, the demands that they make for probably not a lot of money is definitely certainly got people riled up. I mean, the Bernie Sanders of the world and people like that who are just saying, this isn't fair. Everybody should be paying their fair share. And we've also seen examples in world leaders who commit criminal acts and aren't held to account. So I think the idea of Nemesis is something that is, on the minds of a lot of people. Like, where is the justice in the universe? Has Nemesis fled the sphere, right? Has Nemesis and Eidos actually fled and left us with no shame and no balancing force? Well, I mean, I can't answer that question in any kind of definitive way, but I did want to share with you a really interesting story. This is the one I have here is from, this is actually an older one, it's from spring 1987, but it is representing something that's going on right now. They were talking about a companion star to the sun that causes periodic mass extinctions. So they were talking about these ecological catastrophes, like, for example, when the dinosaurs were wiped out. And this was imagine what our record of achievement would be Had our history been disrupted no less than 5 times by titanic nuclear wars, each delivering a destructive blast 10,000 times more powerful than the combined yield of all existing nuclear weapons in the world today. Such upheaval is what many other species, including the dinosaurs, may have faced in the history of our planet, according to theories set forth by a Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory scientist and his colleagues. The theory postulates that every 26 to 30 million years, life on Earth is severely jeopardized by the arrival of a small companion star to the Sun. Dubbed Nemesis, the companion star, through its gravitational pull, unleashes a furious storm of comets into the inner solar system that lasts anywhere from 100,000 years to 2 million years. Of the billions of comets set swarming towards the Sun, several strike the Earth, triggering a nightmarish sequence of ecological catastrophes. We expect that in a typical comet storm, there would be perhaps 10 impacts spread out over 2 million years, with intervals averaging 50,000 years between. Okay, so this is what they were talking about. This is their Nemesis theory. It says, Nemesis was the culmination of a chain of events that began in 1977 in Gubbio, Italy, a tiny village halfway between Rome and Florence. And they were talking about, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but they were doing a study on paleomagnetism. They were looking at this limestone rock outside of Gubbio's attraction because it provides a complete geological record of the end of the Cretaceous period and the beginning of the Tertiary period, which was 65 million years ago, because it closes the age of reptiles when dinosaurs ruled the Earth. Sometimes referred to as the Great Dying, the mass extinction that engulfed the dinosaurs claimed nearly 75% of all species, including most types of plants and many types of microscopic organisms. As much as 95% of all living creatures might have perished. So sandwiched between the limestone of the two periods, forming a clear line of demarcation, is a thin, maybe 1/2 inch thick layer of red clay. Immediately below this clay layer, the Cretaceous limestone is heavily populated with a wide mix of fossils of marine creatures called forams. Above the clay layer, in the Tertiary limestone, however, fossils of but a single species of foram can be seen. The clay layer contains no fossils at all. And but they were finding certain things in there called iridium in there, which is scarce on Earth and definitely suggests the idea of comet impacts. So the conclusion was that the iridium anomaly was a result of a collision between the Earth and an extraterrestrial object approximately 6 miles in diameter. Speculated it was this collision that led to the death of the dinosaurs and other species that perished during the Great Dying. Okay, so they're going to talking about, all the things that can happen. And if you follow up on the whole asteroid or comet hitting the Earth theory for the dinosaurs, there's plenty of information out there on that. But what I think is interesting is it's not so much the planet or the star Nemesis itself that is the problem. It's the fact that its movement can potentially shift these comets towards Earth. Now, very recently, there has been looking again at this idea of Planet X. Now, it's important to understand, we're talking about a companion star to the Sun. So you think, well, it's a star and not a planet, right? Well, the idea was that this Nemesis was a brown dwarf or a red dwarf, kind of like what we talked about when we talked about Louis Saturni with this electric theory of Saturn, right? That it was actually a star that cooled and became a gas giant. And it's postulated that this Planet X, or Planet 9, whatever, is basically 5 times the mass of the Earth, and it's huge, and that its movements, that mathematically, the actual movement that we see of objects in that area, it aligns perfectly to the idea of something with that mass being out there. Now, they said the next time it's probably going to come close to Earth. Let's just see if I think it was at the end of this article here. Not till the year 15 million is it going to return here again. So we're probably okay for the time being. Nonetheless, the idea of this, we were talking about all these companion stars, and now there's seems to be nobody's still seen this Planet X yet, just because of how far away it is and how little light there is, and because it's not within the sun's sphere, it's kind of outside probably the heliosphere, where some kind of light would get out there where that telescopes could pick up on. It's probably the reason that we're not seeing it, given how far away it is. But everything is suggesting that it's there. And, there's been other planetary discoveries that were like that, where we found out about them years, there was a theory that they existed years before somebody actually found them. Okay, so it's quite interesting. And I don't know, I find myself thinking about the fact that, okay, there's so much that's going on right now. We have a lot of stuff going on geologically. We've got a lot of stuff going on with the sun. We're kind of like at solar maximum. And we're having things like, the aurora borealis showing up in places where it normally doesn't. They're talking about the magnetic hole, like kind of getting bigger and moving. That's down by the South Atlantic anomaly. You have deep sea fish coming to the surface. You've got all these volcanoes that are going off all over the world. Like this ring of fire, interestingly, around Greece and Italy, around the area of this, all becoming active again. And then we're starting to see some of these discoveries that are coming through astronomy. And with this revival of the discussion of Planet X coming up again, which again, they're not referring to it as Nemesis at this point, but that was in fact what the original theory referred to this planet as. Again, this companion star to the sun that's almost there it actually almost is creating kind of a counterbalance. But if we think about the idea of Nemesis as retribution, and the idea that, evidence for Nemesis is just kind of making itself known again, I don't know. I just feel like there's something in the collective psyche around this idea of trying to find balance or rebalance in a world that has become dualistic to the point that we're no matter how you look at it, I don't care what side of the equation you're on or what your worldview is, we are wildly out of balance. And I just find, the idea of Nemesis as this kind of dark feminine balancing force that comes in to make sure that those who have too much fortune are not allowed to, that it's not a condition of human life to retain that much good fortune all the time, and that those who mistreat others, whether it be in relationships, whether it be in these other kinds of situations where, again, thinking about the Furies as holding the boundaries, the idea of Nemesis as this kind of boundary holder who kind of keeps her eye on things and says, when things aren't in balance, she's going to come in and recreate that balance. Now, I think I did mention that I was going to talk a little bit about, I was mentioning Indrani, because Nemesis is often considered to be an embodiment of jealousy, Indrani is also, who's the wife of Indra, is also considered to be an embodiment of the vice of jealousy. But I found myself thinking again more and more about the Durga Saptashati, or the Chandipat, which I talk about a lot on this podcast. But it's such an interesting epic in Hinduism where when there is a severe imbalance, like the upset the balance between what they call, Shumba and Nishumba, too much and too little, or between arrogance and self-depreciation. Here we have the theme of arrogance again, and that these are the generals, but we have this idea of too much and too little, and that it's a feminine force that comes in and resets the balance. Durga, we can also connect with Kali in the sense that there's kind of a sense of destruction or downfall that occurs. And in fact, if you look up Nemesis on Wikipedia, it will say, see also Kali, which I think is kind of interesting. So I don't know. It's like this, and some people are talking about the spring equinox, which will be coming up on March 21st, I think, this year. I'd have to double check the actual date, but nonetheless, the idea, some people postulate, and I don't know if I agree with this or not, but some people are saying that this is the end of what they call Kali Yuga, which is an era of extreme greed and materialism. It's like the bottom of a cycle. So you will hear people talking about this in various capacities, talking about this 26,000-year cycle, or I don't know. Everybody has a different determination of how long the cycle is, that it may actually be coming to an end right now. So, I don't know. So thoughts of Nemesis, and then we start hearing all about Planet X again in a completely unrelated scientific context. So these are all things that I think of as kind of synchronicities out there in the system. What they all ultimately mean, I don't know, but I just think that they're worth thinking about. So anyway, that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about Nemesis and who she is today, and what her role is vis-a-vis fortune, vis-a-vis justice, and how she has this. She is the one that helps maintain the balance of the universe, in spite of the fact that she tends to be viewed now, when we use the word nemesis, we think of it as somebody who's going to, upset our plans, or somebody who just has it in for us, your nemesis. But the nemesis, and it also not gets couched in a good versus evil way, but nemesis is not evil. Nemesis is there to check things when things are out of balance, when the universe is out of balance in some fashion. So anyway, hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want to check out all of my work, it will be on Chthonia.net. Which might be moving this year. I haven't quite decided about that. I'll post an update to Patreon about that if I am, and probably something to Instagram as well, or I'll mention it in the weekly Wednesday live streams that I do on YouTube, on the Chthonia YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Chthonia Podcast /@Chthonia Podcast. I am at Chthonia Podcast on Instagram, and Chthonia Podcast, 2 words, on Facebook. If you want to join my Patreon, it's at patreon.com/Chthonia. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.